So it seems that we've got our first reveals for Codex Imperial Knights coming out this week. There's a brand new army rule, 4 new detachments including a powerful damage boost with a defensive line. Though it seems that Armigers could be very limited going forward as it looks like they're losing Battleline. Let's talk about the new rules and what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking nightly rules previews. Games Workshop having just dropped a rather big article that talks through the new detachments in the Codex, basically revealing the vast majority of 2 detachments and a few juicy details about the others. This is all associated with Games Workshop's big release week. We've got Space Marines and Imperial Knights coming out. These are all going up for pre-order on Saturday the 6th of September. Space Marine combat patrols and characters, and of course the new nightly Codex with the Knight Defender box set. As a result, we're starting to get our first teasers of how the Knights are going to function. I will likely know the full details of the Codex by the end of the week. As ever, if you were looking to pick up any of the releases at the weekend, check out the affiliate links down in the video description if you want a discount on them and to help support Auspex Tactics at the same time. Here are the pre-order times for when the models go live at those stores. It's usually midnight Eastern Time in North America and then between 10 and midday elsewhere. A big thank you to anyone supporting via those. Getting into the Knights rules though, and the main content of what we've got is the new Knight Army rule, then some really quite extensive previews out of 2 of the 4 detachments. Games Workshop maybe being a bit more generous than they sometimes are with those ones, and basically showing off over half the rules. For the last 2 detachments we've got a teaser of their army rules, though not much else. In any case though, Code Chivalric has been a pretty spectacularly powerful army rule for the Imperial questing Knights. There were 2 options that you could take, but given the sheer power of the re-rolling hits and wound rolls, that was basically the one that almost everyone took. Re-rolling a hit and wound roll every time you attack is a big deal, and then you had the bonus quest to try and slay the enemy warlord. If you did so, then you became honoured, getting 3 command points, another huge deal when applies to powerful knightly stratagems, and boosting the army to a 5+ feel no pain via the detachment rule. Though it sounds like that bit will be gone, given that there's no detachment that's associated with feel no pain anymore. It was maybe a bit of a simplistic army rule though, and kind of not really very functional in there was just one clearly much better way to use it than the other option. So there was some anticipation for what they might choose to do with it, and whether or not they could change up the formula a bit. The way it's been rewritten is that you have deeds that are your quests to go out and do, and then your knightly qualities, which are the buffs that the knights get. There's now 3 options for each of these rather than 2, and they can both be chosen independently rather than having one of your quests tied to one of the buffs. First up, if you do your quest/deed style thing, then you get a reward of some command points. Though it sounds like this one has been nerfed a bit to try and reward a bit of gambling. If you achieve your deed/quest, then you do get a command point reward, but they stated that you only get a 3 command point reward if you determine the 2 abilities randomly, so if you roll randomly for one of the 3 buffs and quests. They didn't say specifically what the command point reward would be if you picked them. I'd guess it would be 1 command point if you picked them both. I guess there might be a middle level where if you roll 1 randomly and pick the other, then it might be 2 CP. It's hard to know that without the full details. Overall though, it feels like the reward is just a little bit nerfed, given that I suspect that most players will wind up picking the ones they want as opposed to rolling randomly, so that means that you aren't going to be getting 3 command points like you would before. Otherwise, I've seen some confusion and different interpretations as to whether or not the quality buff is a reward for doing your quest deed or not. That seems to have come up in discussion around it, but I don't think there's anything that implies that in the article to me. I strongly suspect that the way it works is that you'll have the deeds that can get the command point reward, and then the buffing quality will just be something that's always on for your knights all the time, as otherwise you basically just don't get an army rule at all until you've achieved an army-wide deed, which against some opponents might be very hard or even undoable. The way it works at the moment is that you get your buffing quality straight away, and particularly given that you still get the command point reward as the reward for doing the quest thing, I strongly suspect that that'll be the main incentive, and you'll get the buff right from the word go. Obviously kind of hard to be 100% sure until we get the full wording though I do suspect that I'm right in that interpretation. I guess we'll see. In any case, to jump into the deeds and benefits, these are the 3 options for the deeds, and as you can see you can either roll randomly for them on a d6 or pick them. First up, we have the classic lay low the tyrants, which has been made easier. Rather than having to destroy your enemy's warlord, you can now pick one enemy character model that you're going to try and destroy over the course of the game, chosen at the start of the game, and then the opponent might have to decide whether or not they're playing risky with them or keeping them back. That has got a bit easier, as you now have the option to choose, as opposed to always having to choose the warlord. Next up, there's one called Reclaim the Realm. To do this one and get your command point reward, you have to control more objective markers than the opponent at the end of their turn. that will be something that you're probably trying to do, though in any sort of fairly balanced primary game of Warhammer 40k, it feels like it's going to be a very hard one. The opponent doesn't even need to control more objectives than you, they just need to equal you, and they'll just have had their entire turn to move forward, destroy your models holding the objectives, or even just throw cheap objective control units into the mid-board to deny you the score. It just seems unlikely that that one's going to be one that you do easily unless you're very ahead on the primary game or playing very aggressively early on. Finally though, the one that seems most reliable against the majority of armies to me is Reaper Great Tally, and this completes at the end of a turn in which you've destroyed more enemy units than the current battle round number. So say you've destroyed 2 enemy units battle round 1 or 3 by the end of battle round 2. There's a good chance you might not be able to do it battle round 1 unless they've left a bunch of stuff exposed with infiltrators and things, though that's not impossible. But I feel like against a fair few armies, when they've committed to the fight more fully on battle round 2, there's a pretty reasonable chance that you could achieve that quite easily. It seems like if you're picking them, then that one's probably the one to go for, and if you're rolling randomly, there's at least a pretty reasonable chance you're going to find this very hard to do indeed. Before we move on to the quality rewards, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in the Magnet Baron. They're a seller of wargaming magnets based in the USA. I have really quite a lot of themes detailed kits that aimed to support specific models in Warhammer 40k, which maybe Knights players might find kind of useful if you're looking to pick up some new ones. I've certainly found great value from magnetising Imperial Knights in my own hobby. They're big and expensive kits that take a while to paint up, and the Games Workshop ones tend to be at least fairly modular with the ability to swap out different weapons. Particularly for the Questoris ones, it's nice just to be able to flex out the loadouts if you want to field, say, a Crusader or a Gallant, and I also quite like to magnetise them at the waist for transport and storage as well. The Magnet Baron's got a good number of Knight kits aimed at the different chassis that Games Workshop makes. They've built up quite a roster of ones that are supported by some 3D printed components, meaning that you can completely use the magnetised kits without having to drill anything at all, which is quite impressive. These ones tend to be supported by some good instructions as well to show you each stage of the build process, and might make things a fair bit easier if you're a bit more new to the magnetising side of the hobby. They've got plenty more on offer though, so feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Moving on to the quality for the Code Chivalric, and these are the buffs that the Knights have active throughout the game. As mentioned, the article seems to have some debate as to whether or not they're active straight away or not, though my guess will be that they will be. Again, like the deeds, you can either choose or roll randomly. I feel like the titles of these are a bit irritatingly wordy. It seems that what they've gone for is to make 2 halves of a sentence, so you can say the first bit as the first bit of your vow, and then add it on to the second bit of this, but it does make the titles of these abilities a bit less memorable. In any case, the big reroll one is still here, with our Martial Valor risen overall as the name for that now. That's still the all-reliable reroll 1 hit roll and 1 wound roll whenever you're chosen to shoot or fight. So basically the same as the Lay Low the Tyrants one that the Knights get all the time right now, and this is just an absolutely great damage boost to have across an army, particularly a Knight one that tends to have really quite big punchy attacks that can hit things very hard indeed. Excellent for things like Thunderstrike Gauntlets or the Knight Castellan's Volcano Lance. Compared with the rest, I'd still expect this one to be the most desired one out of the 3. Then we've got And We Are Eager for the Challenge. This one's a +2 inch move and a +1 to advance and charge. It is legitimately useful for getting your Knights where they need to be, maybe a little bit more excessively so for Knights charging into melee than ranged ones, I suppose. Even if it is a good buffing rule though, I just can't help but feel it's just not quite the same excess value that those big damage rerolls will be. Then finally there's an OC one, +2 OC and +1 leadership. That one called Yet Our Legacy Be Unsullied. It's definitely not unhelpful and would give Knights a bit more weight on objective markers, though I'd still say that's the weakest out of the 3 of them, and a lot of times it won't make much difference. Overall, for first impressions of these, I'd still guess that the rerolls one is just going to be the one that's picked automatically. I don't think that gaining extra command points from rolling randomly is going to be a good reason to go against that, and depending on the exact mechanics for how the command point rule works, I guess I'd be more tempted to pick the Destroy Units one to achieve the Ds. Will certainly be interesting to see the full text on this one though, just so we can confirm how they interact. Moving on beyond the core rule though, and we have the 4 detachments of the Imperial Knights Codex, Games Workshop having revealed their names and themes. It seems that we've got a Valourstrike Lance, a balanced speedy successor of the Index Detachment, a Spearhead at Arms which is Armiger themed, a Gate Warden Lance which seems like a more ranged orientated detachment, focusing around Knights fighting around a defensive line, and then Questoris Companions. This one's a Titanic Knight focused one which doubles down on the core army rule mechanic. On top of this, they still have the Questor Forge Pact one, where you can ally in some AdMech, though unfortunately it really wasn't done in a particularly strong or interesting way. And as per normal, I'd expect you to be able to use all units and all detachments here. Maybe the biggest difference to army construction is that it looks like Armigers are only Battleline in the Spearhead at Arms one, which I'll get onto. And as per normal in 10th edition, I'm sure the detachments will support their army themes far better than other things. For the previews though, the biggest ones that we got were for the Questoris Companions Titanic one, and then the Gate Warden's Lance defensive one. And Questoris Companions doubles down on the core army rule with the Oath and then the Deed and Quality. And basically this changes up the mechanic so that if you do manage to achieve your deeds, then you basically unlock a further buff with an extra quality and an extra deed to do. Exact mechanics around rolling randomly versus choosing are still a little bit unclear until we've got the full text for those. So I guess if you've got the option, it's going to make sense to choose them here, as the command point reroll that you get for doing any subsequent deeds is dropped down to 1. So I guess for this one you'll start with one of the buffs active, and then if you can achieve your deed as well as the command point bonus, you'd unlock the next deed to do, so have the chance to gain another command point that way, and also add a quality buff in. So it sounds like you could pretty rapidly have reroll a single hit and wound roll, and then also have the speed boost as well, which seems rather good. It does seem potentially really quite powerful, and looks like it would make sense to choose the get kills one to try and get that active as soon as possible, unless one of the others is going to be particularly easy for some reason. Though at the same time it is a detachment rule that could be kind of painful if your opponent counterplays, maybe deliberately tries to not allow you to get unit kills early on in the game. And if so, then that might mean that you're effectively fighting with no detachment rule until later in the game. If you went first and the opponent didn't expose anything turn 1, and then they didn't allow you to kill 3 units turn 2, you might not get an extra buff from this detachment rule until all the way till turn 3 or later. They've given us a generous preview of plenty of the stratagems and enhancements for this detachment as well, and these ones do all look like they're locked to the Titanic Knights. It maybe feels like it's the equivalent of the Chaos Knights Lord of Dread detachment. Particularly in line with that is one called Hero's Tread, and that's really quite similar to a stratagem that they have. A Knight's Titanic model that's within range of an objective marker that you can control can mark it in the command phase as a sticky objective, and again if you move off it then you still have 5 OC control over it, so small characters and things won't be able to just swipe your objective on its own. It's not quite as powerful as the Lord of Dread one, as you don't get to do it for free each turn as the detachment rule, and that one's any phase, where this one is at the end of your command phase, so a bit more limited there. It's still a great stratagem to have though, particularly if you're building an army that's focusing around the Titanic Knights. Otherwise we've got Moment of Glory, which gives you a 6-inch consolidate for a knight, provided that your model ends up in engagement range. That's pretty handy to move on to tie up the next thing in the enemy army. Occasionally it could be situationally pretty useful for that, and if your opponents had screens then it might have been potential that you could charge one thing, destroy it, and then consolidate onto an enemy unit on an objective marker to swing that potentially. It seems like a handy enough situational one, though not one you'd use every turn. And finally for 2 CP there's Unstoppable Warrior. This one's 4-back shoot and charge for a Titanic Knight, maybe something that some people might have hoped that Super Heavies had in general in 10th, but this one seems like in the right situation again it could be really quite big. It's helpful for the Knight Castellan in particular, which can really not enjoy having things tie it up, particularly given that you can't fire your blast weapons into the same combat as yourself. It also means that a Titanic Knight in a disadvantageous combat could pull back, shoot something and then charge either the same thing or something else. It's definitely got the potential to have a big impact, but at 2 command points it is pricey. Then finally we've got a teaser of a couple of enhancements. Herald of Triumph is a once per game battle shock at -1 for every unit in engagement range. I kind of hope that that one will be cheap, seeing as it's just a bit situational. It's basically an unreliable way to turn stratagems off for the opponent in a single fight phase in the game, or maybe stop them from contesting an objective against a secondary, but overall it's kind of niche, particularly when it's on an enhancement and you can't flex the knight that uses it. Maybe a bit more interesting is the Pennant of Silvered Fury. This one gives you a once per game sustained hits 2 to the bearer's melee weapons. Again, maybe not quite so reliable as something that would give you buffs throughout the entire game, but that's a pretty serious buff in one round of melee. If your knight didn't already have sustained hits, then it's essentially a plus 50% damage boost to most of the ones that hit on a 3+, that will be quite wildly swingy depending on the number of 6s that you roll. As an addition, it does seem that these once per game abilities can also be refreshed as well. I guess that might be on the army rule. Apparently if you achieve one of your deeds then they get to be replenished so you can use them once more, though that might depend a little bit as to how that lines up naturally with your knights doing their thing. Overall certainly seems interesting enough so far though. The army core rule could be really quite powerful if you can get some kills in early and trigger the second rule. The stratagems generally seem useful enough, though maybe the Hero's Tread one is the most reliably useful of them, and that sustained hits 2 melee seems pretty good, though would depend on its points cost. Next up, we've got a detachment with some genuinely powerful sounding buffs, though also a rather interesting and different positioning limitation. This one's called the Gate Warden Lance, and it's trying to evoke the theme of Imperial Knights as defenders of the Imperial realm, and this detachment is themed maybe a bit more around ranged knights manning a defensive line. The core rule for this detachment is called Dauntless Defenders. That's a bit different to most other things in 40k so far. You basically select 2 objective markers on the board to be your foundations at the start of the game, and then they generate your defensive line, an imaginary line drawn directly between the 2 objectives. Any knight that has its base that crosses that defensive line is said to be on it, and that basically allows you to use most of your stratagems, buffs and enhancements. The core benefit for being on that defensive line is really quite a solid one in the first place though. It allows you to ignore modifiers to the hit roll, and also gives you sustained hits 1 on your attacks, both at range and in melee. So pretty good benefits there. It's just the board restriction that's the slightly tricky bits to get around, and they also limit it so it only applies to things that you can see as well, so it won't apply to say some Ironstorm missile pods. I feel like that's quite a fun theme, and to naturally mean that your knights want to draw themselves up in a line to shoot the enemy very hard. It does seem like it'd be quite a lot easier to use at range rather than in melee, unless you may be countercharging something that's already charged onto your defensive line. But beyond that, it seems just quite easy to say have a bunch of Knight Crusaders march up onto it and shoot very hard. The ignores hit roll modifiers bit could be pretty great for getting around the big guns never tire thing, and maybe could be useful for knights being degraded too. And you could have some options for which defensive line your knights choose. I guess you could draw one down the centre of the board between the 2 furthest mid-board objectives. We could draw between your home field or your natural expansion objective, where you think that quite a lot of knights would be present and fairly safe to sit and shoot. Or even draw between your home board and the enemy's objective, I guess. I'm not sure that sounds like necessarily the best idea in the world, but it would mean that lots of knights in the mid-board get damage buffs very easily. It does sound like you could have some hard choices here though. Knights don't have loads of units running around, and it could mean that there's very real trade-offs between keeping them on the defensive line or moving them up to get lines of sight or charge down enemies. For the stratagems they've previewed, there's one for a defensive buff, 1 command point for Lancebreaker, which is a -1 to wound for high strength attacks that are higher than your toughness, applying only in the fight phase on your defensive line. It's okay as a defensive buff, will generally make your knight tougher, but does feel a bit niche given that your knight both needs to be there, and also a lot of the attacks that you're going to be suffering aren't going to be strength 10 or 12 or higher. For 1 command point, there's Drive Them Out. This one gives you critical hits on a 5+ against an enemy unit on your defensive line. This one's going to be at least somewhat within your opponent's control. A good reason to be slightly off the line if you can be, and there might be at least some chance that you could be very close to that defensive line without necessarily being on it, even if you charged a knight on the line. Pretty solid when it triggers though, and you get the extra sustained hits. And then finally there's a pretty strong and easy to use one called Titanic Bombardment. If you're able to keep a knight stationary on your defensive line for a turn, it can flex into sustained hits 2 rather than sustained hits 1. Potentially could be pretty nasty for a crusader standing and shooting against an enemy unit that just charged it, and maybe combine with the criticals on 5s with Drive Them Out. I feel like that one's going to be a bit situational though, as it implies that your knight's not going to have to move to either get to the line or get lines of sight on the enemies that it wants to shoot. I kind of wonder whether it might combo well with the Knight Defender's conversion beam though. If that one can get some critical hits on a 4+ within a certain range, then that could be very interesting indeed. Then finally we've got some enhancements for the Warden Lance. First up there's Acquisitor at Arms. This one allows you to buff an Armiger for a whole bunch of extra OC if it's on your defensive line, and you've given that Armiger your Bondsman ability. That means as well as any Bondsman buff that the Armiger might get, is going to go up to a casual OC 16, which is pretty big. Most of the time that's going to be enough to secure any objective that it might well be standing on, and a good chance that the opponent's going to have to outright destroy that Armiger if they want to take that point. It certainly seems alright if it's cheap enough and there's not something better to take. Otherwise though, there's Vengeful Tread. This one's a nice straightforward 0 CP tank shot once per turn. A pretty solid melee damage boost to any knight out there, usually around about 3 or 4 mortal wounds on average on the charge. Quite nice that it's not locked to a defensive line thing like most of the rest of the detachment seems to be. Though it looks like it doesn't allow you to use extra copies of Tank Shock or anything like that, it just means that if you use it this turn, then on this night it's free. If that's priced well enough though, then that's a very easy one to get value from. Overall, at first impressions, this one seems like a very interesting detachment. Quite nice to have a more unusual mechanic for gaining the buffs, and the buffs do seem fairly powerful. I do wonder if whether in practice they're really going to outweigh the positioning advantage though. As on busy 40k battlefields with a whole bunch of ruins blocking lines of sight, you might just not be able to maintain on that defensive line and shoot the units that you want to. Finally, we've got the last 2 detachments. Apparently the Valourstrike Lance is the new name for the Noble Lance, and it does indeed look like the Imperial Knights Christmas Battle Force box set that we had last time around was indeed teasing a new detachment name. As a result, I guess this one might be a fairly balanced general purpose one. I suspect quite a few of the stratagems will have some fairly similar abilities. The only thing that we know about this one so far for guaranteed is that it's swapping out its Feel No Pain rule for a speed buff one. It does seem that's going to be quite a big deal for the army overall. Feel No Pain was just a pretty great buff for the raw might of Imperial Knights. You often can't hide all the knights from enemy shooting, so they're taking damage right from the word go, and a flat increase to the damage and keeping them alive that bit longer was a really big and easy buff to get advantages out of. It also means that you won't be going up to the big 5+ Feel No Pain if you're honoured either. Instead, these knights are going to be speedy and shooty, it would seem. You get to reroll advanced rolls for the knights in the detachment, and when you're advancing around the board, you get the assault keyword on your guns. Maybe seems a little bit like the themes of House Raven from previous editions. As a result, looks like it's going to be a great detachment for things like Helverins, Castellans, and Crusaders. Being able to run and gun and get lines of sight quite so easily on that seems like it's rather nice. I would guess that there will be stratagems that will help out in melee as well. I wonder if they might even give it an advance and charge one, so you could actually get some good value from the detachment rule for melee knights. Maybe they'll have that as an option for an enhancement or something. Finally, we've got the Armiger focused one, which is called the Spearhead at Arms. And I was maybe slightly surprised to hear that the Armigers will only be Battleline in this detachment. It certainly seemed possible if you drew parallels with the Chaos Knight War Dogs, but I was wondering whether or not the Imperials will be treated differently, just due to them having so much fewer Armigers in their detachments as opposed to the Chaos ones. It means for the majority of the Knight detachments out there, you're only going to be able to field 6 Armigers from the core Codex, going up to 9 if you make use of the Forge World Moirax datasheet. So at least for most players, just about every knight list bar this one should be pretty heavily focused on the Titanic Knights. That's perhaps not the worst thing in the world, but won't exactly be helpful for real people's collections out there, given that you say might have 6 Armiger Warglaves and not be able to field that many in most of the detachments now. In any case, the core rule for this one is that Bondsman abilities affect 3 Armigers. Presuming it stays the same as the index, they're only able to affect 1 at present, so it maybe feels like a bit of an additional rule that isn't super standout. Being boosted to affect way more though could mean that the actual combos of Titanic Knights versus the Armigers that you pick will be so much more impactful. If say the Warden keeps its -1 damage for Armigers, then that's going to make a whole load of your advancing Warglaves very hard to kill. Like the Houndpat Lance for the traitors, I strongly suspect that stratagem support will largely be locked to Armigers only, and you won't get so much for the big guys in this one. Hopefully it will be playable, though it feels like if one of them has to be strongest, it's probably best to be one of the ones that has a Titanic Knight focus, a bit more so than the Armigers, which will be useful anyway. Finally, for clues for the article, it seems that we've just got one tiny teaser for the Knight Gallant. They mentioned that it'll be getting lethal hits in some way. It looks like the Chaos Knight Rampager gains sustained hits 1, so maybe that's the Imperial equivalent of that. It's certainly not the worst extra buff to have, though the majority of the time it will be wounding on a 3+ or a 2+, maybe limiting its impact a fair bit. Lethal hits tends to be more impactful for lower strength weapons punching up than high strength weapons punching down. In any case, let me know what you make of the first Knight rules previews though. What do you make to the change of the army rule and the new detachment? I look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. As mentioned, if you are looking to pick up the Codex or anything at the weekend, check out the affiliate links down in the video description. They help to support the channel. I'll leave that one there for now though. A big thank you to the Magnet Baron for sponsoring the video. There'll also be links down in the video description below if you want to check out their magnetic kits for the Knights. As mentioned, they've got a good amount of them available. One's for the Questoris Knight with Canis Rex. Plenty of other ones available for the other Knight chassis out there, and loads of other things as well. Magnets to go under bases, starter sets with a whole bunch of tools for people jumping into this side of the hobby, flight stand magnetic bases, and just supplies of every size and shape of magnets that you might want for wargaming. You can find them links down in the video description if you'd like to check them out, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. I'll hopefully be looking forward to talking some more Imperial Knights later in the week, so feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like that. I'll certainly be doing a full Codex review once we get it. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. Check out the affiliate discount links and the Patreon page down in the video description if you want to support the videos that I make. A massive thank you to anyone doing so, and otherwise an enormous thank you for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.